we started to look at the Sermon on the Plain, and one of the initial requisites for this particular sermon was the fact that it is relationship driven. And bear in mind, and this is going to be one of the key pieces to understanding what Jesus was driving at when he was presenting this message, is the diversity of the crowd. When he is presenting the Sermon on the Plain, he is speaking to Jews, he is speaking to Gentiles who did not get along. There's possibly Samaritans, there's rich folk, there's going to be some poor folk, there's very likely some slaves, there's people from different ethnic backgrounds. It is a melting pot of people that have come together and are listening to him speak. And unlike the Sermon on the Mount, which has a lot of different angles in which it talks about a relationship with God and one another, etc. and so forth, the Sermon on the Plain almost exclusively focuses upon our relationship with one another. How do we get along? And in a day and age when there is all sorts of fighting and issues happening, no matter where you go, it could be in the home, it could be in the workplace, in the school, certainly in our community, we have a lot of folk who are at each other's throats. And we have a lot of isms out there. You know, we have favoritism. And we're not the first to experience that in different scenarios. This was a problem even in the book of James. You know, the treatment of rich people versus poor people in the church was a problem. We have nepotism, where there's favoritism toward a family member based on your position at a company or in power. And even Jesus mentions it when he's talking to Peter about the taxes. You know, the king's sons are exempt from taxes and things like that. We see that happening today. And, you know, there's sexism, there's racism, there's fascism. Talk to anybody who holds to a biblical position on a college campus, and they are being shut down very rapidly by anybody who holds to something differently. And we have that hostility that's growing. And we live in a culture, in a country today where people are having a very difficult time getting along. And there's the old classic story of the guy who's out on the desert island and he's been stranded for years, and finally a rescue boat sees him and they come in and they notice that he has these 3 huts on the shore. And they rescue this guy and they say, well, what's with the 3 huts? And the guy says, well, the one over here on one side, that's my home. And then and said, well, what's with the other 2 huts? Well, you know, the one over on the other side, that's my current church. And they said, well, what's with the hut in the middle? He says, well, that's my former church. And and this is a problem we have. Just getting along with ourselves is a problem, let alone the person sitting in the pew next to us. And this is not something that is a new issue. It has transcended time. The people who are sitting, and I want you to envision this for a moment. You're sitting on the ground. Jesus has just performed a variety of miracles, and people are stunned. They're in awe. Their attention is now focused upon Christ. He's about to teach. He gives a series of blessings and woes, and he's basically saying, you really need to be committed to following after me. If you're going to put the rest of this message into practice, you've got to have a commitment to putting me as Lord over your life. And this is where he puts forth, this is what's going to happen in Jewish tradition. If you do follow and if you don't follow, here's the outcome in both directions. And then he goes on to explain how we need to begin to start to get along. And bear in mind, economics has separated these people. As you look around, you're going to see people with different types of clothes. You're going to see the culture has separated them in terms of what they do, their occupations. You're going to have some folk who are farmers, fishermen. You're going to have tax collectors. You're going to have some religious people there. You may even have a few religious leaders. Ethnicity is going to separate this group. There's going to be different races. You're going to have a lot of slaves actually in the group, as well as people who are free, as well as citizens. But the big division that's going to separate this group and is going to create a schism is religion. There's a variety or a plurality of beliefs that are sitting right there on the ground listening to Jesus. And we know this to be the case because even within Judaism there's fighting. At this point in time in history, there are various sects of Judaism that are at each other's throats. You have the Sadducees, who discount all of the Old Testament except the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, and they're very wealthy. They're the political group, and they're in with the Romans. You have the Pharisees, who are the populists. They're among the people, and they're making up all sorts of rules and regulations that people are struggling with. You have the Zealots. They're the cloak and dagger group. They hate Rome so much. They're out murdering people, and they are sticking people with knives and creating all sorts of mayhem. And then you have the Essenes, and there's probably a few of them floating around, who are the separatists. They want to live in the bubble wrap, and they're way out in the desert, living under a rock, and they don't want to have anything to do with anybody else. And here you have this group of people coming together with all these walls up. The question is, how do they come down? And really the question that Jesus is going to resolve as he presents the rest of this message is exactly the same message that we need today. In a world filled with separation, whether it be over politics, whether it be over ideology, whether it be over religion, there is some very potent lessons right here. And the first one we find in what Jesus tells us starting in verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. And whoever takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. That final verse perhaps can cure and fix more of the problems in our country today. One simple verse. It's called the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule is whoever has the gold makes the rules. That's not the Golden Rule, all right? I want to dispel that. The Golden Rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And let's unpack this a little bit for the next few moments. We have 4 actions, and then we have this series of people that Jesus describes. If you look at the actions that Jesus implores us and exhorts us to take, number 1, you have love. Number 2, you have to do good, and this is an action. Number 3 is to bless. This is going to be your words. And then finally, to pray. The attitude is key. Jesus says, he who has an ear to hear. Who's listening here? Who's cueing in? And most people, well, yeah, I'm listening. Well, are you really? Because the notion here of listening in Hebrew, and bear in mind, this is a very Jewish type sermon. When someone says, are you hearing me? The concept of Shema in Hebrew conveys the notion of not just listening and comprehending, but acting upon what you've just heard. So if I turn around and say, hey, have you heard me this morning? And I'm going to ask her a response, what would you say? Yes. Okay. Somebody's hearing out there. If I ask you the question, did you catch what I just said? We have somebody who just responded back, and there was a reaction. That's what Jesus is looking for here. So he says the first thing is there's got to be this notion of love. We've got to dispel what love is not. And one of the things that very often in our culture, we think love is just tolerating everything out there. Love is not turning around and saying, it's okay to go out there and sin and do stupid things. It isn't. That is not love. And unfortunately, we live in a culture that says, we just got to tolerate this, that, and everything else, and that's what... No, that's not how it works. Love is not an emotion. When he talks here and uses the word agape, he is not talking about the warm, fuzzy feelings that everybody's going to have, and we're going to sing kumbaya. That's not what we're talking about here. All right? It's not camaraderie. It's not like being with your buds watching the Buccaneers play and whooping somebody. It's not about that. I don't know if you guys are NFL fans. I like watching some football, and the NFL family comes together, and in some places, this happened to me down in Dallas. I was walking around. I had a Dallas Cowboys sweatshirt on. It was just given to me. All right, I wasn't a big Cowboys fan at the time. I'm walking around the airport in the DFW airport down in Dallas. I was picking up my wife and kids. After they were flying down from Jersey. I have this sweatshirt on. It's a Sunday afternoon. There's a game on. I had people flocking up to me. Hey, what's going on with the game? It was like we were buddies and friends for like years. I'm like, I don't know anything about this stuff. I had to flub my way through because my fear was they might figure out through my accent that I wasn't from Texas, and I'd be swinging from a tree in a few moments. To give them any hint that maybe I'm rooting for the Giants or somebody else would be like, the death knell for me. It's not camaraderie and it's not commonality. It's not just having a bunch of things in common with people. The concept of love here, and we see Paul outlining it in his very famous passage in 1 Corinthians, tells us this, that love is what? It's patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. Love does not brag, and it is not arrogant. It does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked. It does not take into account a wrong suffered. does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and then it will go on to say love never fails. That's a picture of love. It is an unconditional commitment to the well-being of other people around us. It has nothing to do with emotions. Emotions could be there, but that doesn't necessarily serve as a requisite for it. But this is what Jesus is saying has to undergird our decision and our desire to interface with the people around us. That is the requisite. Take love off the table, you're not going to do anything. Take love out of the equation, you're a resounding gong or clanging cymbal. If I don't have love in my heart, all the good deeds in the world are going to come to naught when I stand before the judgment seat of God. So this is the first step. It says to do good. To do good, and this is the second set of the second piece here. This is an action. Listen to what John says in his epistle. He says, "Little children, let us not love with word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth." And the whole concept here is that, if there's going to be true agape love within a person's heart toward the folk around them, that is going to translate to some form of an action. That could be a meal. That could be a ride. That could be raking leaves. It's fall and leaves are falling, and it's going to be more leaves on the ground. And you may know somebody who has a yard that needs some raking, and that would be an act of love, is to reach out. Just visiting with people. One of the greatest gifts we can give to someone today is camaraderie. We've been cooped up with this COVID business, and just pick up the phone. Call somebody, write them a note. There's a lot of lonely people running around planet Earth, and there's many of them right here in our community. And just reaching out and, befriending somebody or just asking them how they're doing, paying attention to any need that they may have. These are some very simple, practical steps that every one of us in this room can take. You don't have to be a billionaire to be able to go out there and show some love to people around you. Whatever gifts, whatever resources, whatever talents that God has given to you, take whatever that is, and it could be just a little bit, and use that to be a blessing to other people. And I read this great testimony of this woman over in England. She had this horrible disease where she suddenly became like paralyzed, and it was permanent. It was some sort of a neurological issue. And she was laying there in bed and wondering, what could I do? I have absolutely no capacity to even get out of this bed. Somebody had to take care of her 24/7. And she figured, I'm going to just start praying for people. And she had like these lists all over the place of all these missionaries and people that she would just pray for. That's how she was showing her care and her compassion for other folk. And it's just that simple and that pragmatic. So we have here this action. When Jesus says to go ahead and bless them, the notion of blessing here is eulogo in Greek, and it carries, that's where we get the word eulogy. And when you go to a funeral and you hear a eulogy, what is that? You're speaking well of the person who is deceased. It's that moment right before they close the casket where we're going to share a few good thoughts and maybe a story or two about a particular person. And the whole notion here, blessing or eulogo, carries the notion here of being grateful, of being thankful, of being an encouragement, of just putting some wind in somebody else's sails. The Bible speaks often about, watching our tongue, being careful about complaining, be careful about criticizing, be careful about cutting others down. There's a lot of negativity out there. Go to Facebook, go on any social media platform, turn on the news, just turn it off very quickly. But even if you turn it on for even like a second or two, what's going to happen? You're going to get bombarded with all sorts of garbage and negativity and people cutting one another down. That is just toxic for our culture. That's going to create a greater sense of schism. What does the Bible tell us to do? We need to build one another up. Listen to what the scriptures tell us in the book of Colossians. Colossians 4:6. Let your speech always be with what? With grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. And before we open our mouth and before we start whining and complaining, I think we need to stop and ask, are these words that are going forth truly loving? Now, let's face it, there's conviction right here. Doesn't always happen with me, and I know it doesn't always happen with you. But this is how we will begin to tear down these walls and build better relationships. It's watching our speech. It's undergirded, though, and this is the key. There needs to be this big warning thing. I don't know why it wasn't put together, like maybe the Bible publishers should do this. But there needs to be a label on every Bible before it goes out. Do not try to attempt to live this on your own. All right? Because, Jesus said it, apart from me you can do nothing. And we need God's help. You look at this list here, and I'm already thinking to myself, man, I'm falling short on every one of these things. And this is why he says to pray. Listen, the scriptures explain, Ephesians 5:18 says this, and do not get drunk with wine. No, that's not the right one. Pray without ceasing. It tells us in Thessalonians. We should pray on all occasions for all people, and whenever things happen, continue to pray. This is where Ephesians, this notion here of constantly being in prayer. And what we have Jesus saying here is that if you're going to try to love somebody, if you're going to try to put this into practice, you have got to be in connection with God. You've got to be praying for them. You've got to be praying for yourself, praying for empowerment, praying for wisdom, praying for the right words, praying when to know just to shut up. There's some times when we just have to be silent. And to have that wisdom, to pray, maybe there's an opportunity to help somebody. Maybe there's someone out there that God has put upon our heart, and we're just for that door to open, possibly to share. Prayer empowers us, it connects us, it sensitizes us. And this is one of the key things, that when we pray for another person, it becomes more and more difficult to hate them. It becomes more and more difficult to hold a grudge against them. It becomes more and more difficult to allow for that wall to continue to perpetuate. Prayer tears these things down. C.S. Lewis once said, prayer doesn't always change God, but it always changes me. And I believe this is why Jesus is explaining to us that we've got to pray. It prepares the soil of the heart. It's sort of like in the springtime. Farmers just don't go out there and start tossing seeds. When you're putting your garden, you just don't go out there and just scatter your cucumber and your zucchini seeds and your pumpkins out on the top of the ground. What do? You have to prepare the soil. You got to plow it through. You got to cultivate it. You got to get it ready so that when that seed goes in there, it can actually grow. Prayer prepares the soil of your heart, my heart, and the person out there who you are going to be interfacing with. Now we have this list here. This is where the problem comes into play. This is easy when you're hanging out with people that you get along with, or neighbors or friends or folk that are, on the same page with you. Who are the people that Jesus puts in this list that we need to love and do good and bless and pray for? He says what? Enemies. People who hate you. People who curse you, and people who mistreat you. Oh yeah. You could just see the crowd saying, what are you talking about? Because now they're all sitting on the ground, and they're looking around, and they're thinking, wait a minute, I haven't talked to them. That's a Samaritan. I'm not going to talk to them. We haven't talked to them in like decades. There's somebody over there. They're a Gentile. Not going near them. You remember Peter had an issue with the Gentiles. He said, I haven't gone near anything unclean. I'm not going to even go, into Gentile territory. I'm not going to speak with these people. I'm not going to interact with these people. They're just going to corrupt me. Bad character corrupts, bad company corrupts good character, we find in Corinthians. And you can just see what's going through these people's minds. And the wall, and he says, listen to the people that he is speaking about. Enemies, those who are irreconcilable, people who are seeking your personal harm. That's an enemy. Those who hate you, they detest, they persecute, they renounce, they reject. Those who curse you, who want to see God bring the boom down upon your head, if you would. Those who mistreat you, they threaten you, they accuse you falsely. These are the people that we're called to love. And it's hard. We have a tough enough time getting along with people that are in our friendship circles, let alone this group. And you could just see the jaws dropping. It must have been very quiet at that moment after he got through this. If I was sitting there listening to this sermon, I would have been like, what are you talking about? How is this going to... you have had centuries of conflict between all of these groups that are assembled together. And Jesus is like, all this has to go away. Think about it though. He came to die on a cross to reconcile what? Enemies. We are by nature enemies of God. Every one of us in this room, when we sin and we fall short of God's glory, we fall into that category of being an enemy. God didn't look down and say, oh, there's Dave, he's this really good guy and everything. No, he didn't. No, I was going in the totally opposite direction. And so were you. And yet Jesus loved us so much and wanted to extend grace to each one of us, that he would send his son to die, to reconcile enemies into a relationship with God. And this is where it becomes very difficult. But he gives us the example, he gives us the power, he gives us the instructions to put it into practice. And now you can almost think, oh, these objections are coming through. And this is where he answers 3 scenarios, 3 objections that most people are probably thinking in their heart at this moment. And Jesus just cuts to the quick, and he says this. If somebody strikes you on the face, gives you the whack across the face, turn to him and give him the other cheek. And what he was saying here, and this is something, this is a public humiliation. If somebody's going to insult you, reject you, most scholars actually believe that this whole notion of the striking or slapping on the face was to throw somebody out of the synagogue. And that was a major problem, to be rejected in such a way where you could not engage in synagogue worship with those in your community. That was cutting off all form of social tie. That was a huge problem, because what would happen is that once that was cut off, economically you were going to be hurt. Socially you were going to be hurt, your reputation was going to be destroyed, your business, everything. They were boxing you out. This was the ultimate of shunning. And this is what he's saying here. One of the things we need to clarify is that this does not apply to what we call self-defense, if somebody's threatening to kill you. Some people will quote this or misquote this. This was an insult. This was a slap. This wasn't an actual attack to try to harm you physically and take your life. And Jesus is not saying you can't defend yourself in this passage. He's also not abdicating civic responsibility for people to prosecute somebody who is guilty of assault. He's not saying that either. He's basically saying, I don't want you to retaliate if somebody insults you. That's what he's getting at here. He talks about taking the cloak. Back in ancient times, you really had 2 garments on you, and then you carried a cloak with you. And the cloak was sort of like a blanket that you wrapped around, you had it with you, and people would put cloaks up for, like sort of collateral. If you're going to borrow a little bit of money, you'd give somebody a cloak, I'll pay you back in a couple of days, and and sometimes you didn't get your money back, and you didn't get your cloak back, and there was this problem with that. And again, he's saying don't retaliate. If somebody borrows something from you and enters into a debt, he's saying, if they turn around and they opt not to pay back, you're not to retaliate. That doesn't mean, and we've got to be clear about this doesn't mean that Jesus is promoting enablement. We've got to clarify that. One of the key ideas here is that he is telling us not to retaliate, but he's also saying, you don't go and be lazy and try to take advantage of people around you. That was a problem with the Thessalonians, and that's where Paul speaks about if you don't work, you don't eat. The apostles would put in place some rules about maybe 80, 90 years after this was penned. At the end of the first century, there was a document called the Didache. And it was created to basically put some rules and regs into church play. And one of them was, the one loaf, one night rule, because people were taking advantage of Christians, their generosity. And basically the one loaf, one rule, night rule was that if somebody shows up at your house and is looking for some help, give them one loaf of bread and let them stay one night, and that's it. They've got to earn the bread that they eat. So, you don't have, this isn't, this whole idea here of enablement and just, constantly feeding somebody's laziness or greed. But what he's saying here is that when someone is trying to take advantage, don't step in and retaliate. Whether it be an insult, whether it be with your cloak, whether it be borrowing some money. This is something that we have to be careful of, because retaliation has made more problems and created a greater level of schism in our culture today than I think ever before. I came across this great illustration of it a couple of years back. There was a fellow, he was a baggage handler down in Miami, and he was at the airport. And there was a whole group of people lined up to get onto the different planes with this particular airline. And that particular airline at that particular time was having a lot of delays. So the lines were getting longer, and it was taking longer to get the bags through onto the right planes. And everybody was waiting in line. And there was this one guy in line that was screaming and yelling at the baggage handlers. I mean, he was just going off. Just, you got to move it. And he was just having a big old fit. And he's cursing and he's yelling. And as he's waiting in line, he's just getting worse and worse and worse. And everybody's just telling him to shut up, you got to calm down. He's like, no, and he's escalating as he's waiting to get his bags checked in for his flight. Well, the manager of the airline comes out and wants everybody to calm down and says, look, we know everything's going slow. We know you're all concerned about missing your flight. All of the planes are going to stay on the tarmac until all of you get checked in. Don't worry, you're not going to miss your flights. Just give us some time and a bit of patience. And of course, everybody's kind of calming down after they hear that, except this one guy who's screaming even louder. Well, he finally gets up to the check-in, and he brings up his suitcase, and he now rips this baggage handler up one side and down the other. I mean, he is yelling at this guy in his face, with the finger and everything else like that. And the baggage handler is just so calm. And this dude, he doesn't, he's just taking it on the cheek. And he's listening to the guy. Yes, sir. Okay, yeah, we're going to take care of you, sir. And, he was just the perfect gentleman. And he sends the baggage on the little conveyor belt. And the guy goes off ranting on his way to his gate, and this couple comes up to the baggage handler and says, buddy, man, you just handled that so well. I can't believe how good of a job you just took it, and we were just so impressed by the fact that, this guy just really laced into you, and you were able to be so professional about how you responded to his assault. And the baggage handler looks at the couple and says, well, ma'am, I'll have to tell you, he's on his way to New York, but his luggage is on its way to Brazil. That's exactly what we're not to do, okay? And what Jesus is getting at here is that you're going to have a lot of reasons and a lot of objections and a lot of opportunities to retaliate in this world. They're going to knock at your door at every turn, even when you put this into practice. This doesn't mean you're going to become popular with folk. What this means is that there's going to be a few moments when that opportunity is going to strike, and you will have the chance to retaliate, and he's saying, don't do it. Finally, he pulls them into the golden rule. After he works through the objections, he speaks what? Do unto others as you would have them do to you. And this is really asking the question, how do I want to be treated? Do I want to be listened to? Do I want to be validated? Do I want people to understand my thoughts and concerns? This doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to go out and just pander to everyone's wishes, but it requires us to tune in to what's happening around us. How do you want to be treated? Do you want to be treated with dignity? Do you want to be treated with respect? Do you want to be treated like a human being? Do you want your opinion to matter? Do you want to be listened to? In our culture, that's not happening. And this is what Jesus is saying. Ask yourself the question, how do I want to be treated in this situation? There was a study done back in the 80s, and they surveyed a group of people who were generally happy, and then they surveyed a group of people who were absolutely miserable. And a large study group. And they found that the people who were generally more jovial and had a better outlook on life and seemed to be getting through life with a bit more gladness of heart lived the golden rule. They weren't all that selfish. They were altruistic. They took the time to think about the people around them before they acted and spoke. The group, on the other hand, that seemed to be more miserable were extremely selfish. They made decisions that revolved around themselves. They were very narcissistic. They really had no concern for the people around them. And they found that it was a very interesting result that it was almost 100% of those surveyed on the one side and 100% on the other side were either of one bent or the other. Either one was very caring and compassionate, concerned, or one was very self-oriented. And the misery level and the happiness level was gauged right there. And I find that to be interesting because there are some people in this world who are absolutely wretched to be around. And very often, who do they think about? Big I. That's what it comes down to. I wanted to share with you and wrap things up with a children's story. And I almost never do this, but I came across a children's story this past week because I was looking at this particular topic is actually a pinnacle in ancient Judaism. The rabbis back in Jesus' day and even prior prioritized this idea of if you're truly a spiritual person and if you're truly walking right with God, if you're in that good relationship with the Lord, if someone was doing that, then they can turn an enemy into a friend. That was considered the litmus test among the rabbis, the ancient rabbis, as to whether or not they're really walking right with God or not. How are your enemies doing? How are you responding to them? And this rabbinical tradition sort of filtered down through the ages. And it impacted a guy by the name of Derek Munson. He's a Jewish fellow. And he heard this teaching, and he wanted to convey it to his son. You know, how do you deal with enemies around you? So Munson went out and he wrote a book. It's a children's book, and I'm going to give you the redacted version of it. Dave's redacted version of it. You know, this morning I'm going to kind of shrink it down a little bit. But he wrote this book, and it was published a few years back. It's called Enemy Pie. There was so enemy pie, that's what we're going to look at. There was the story goes like this. There was this little boy, once upon a time, who lived in a neighborhood, and he had all of his friends, and they would go to school and play games and things like that. And a new kid by the name of Jeremiah moved into the neighborhood. Well, Jeremiah was kind of a charismatic personality. You know, people sort of gravitated to Jeremiah, and suddenly this little boy, some of his friends sort of gravitated over toward Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was fantastic at pitching at baseball. And one day the little boy got up to bat and Jeremiah struck him out. So he was like insulted in front of all of his friends, and he really felt bad. You know, now this guy is, you know, drawing all these kids to himself, and he's a good baseball player, and this boy Jeremiah now has some sort of a little get together, and this boy wasn't invited. So he comes home and he is steaming mad, and he gets out a piece of paper and he writes down enemy across the top, and he puts Jeremiah's name on it, and he climbs up in his treehouse and he nails it to this inside of his treehouse. He's like, Jeremiah's my enemy, he'll never come in my treehouse. And he's just, you know, red as can be. He's mad. And he comes downstairs, and he goes in the house that day, and he says to his dad, Dad, I got an enemy, and his name is Jeremiah, and he lives up the street. And his dad, oh, you have an enemy, do you? And he said, yes, I do. And he explains all the problems that Jeremiah created for him over the last week. And the father looks at his son, he says, well, you know what we have to do with our enemies, don't you? And the boy's eyes, what do we do? He's like, we need to make them enemy pie. Enemy pie? He's like, yeah, we got to make them enemy pie. I got the recipe right here. And he pulls out this cookbook, and he opens it up, and there's this tattered old card in there, and he pulls out the recipe, and the little boy, he's all excited. Oh, we're going to serve him enemy pie. So he's like, oh, I'm going to help you get some ingredients. And he runs outside with his bucket, and he gets like rocks and mud and, you know, a couple worms and some weeds, and he brings them all back in. He's like, well, let's put them in the enemy pie. I said, no, it doesn't work that way. I'm going to make the enemy pie, but in order for this to really be effective on an enemy, tomorrow you got to go over and play with Jeremiah. You got to convince him to come to our house for a meal, and we'll serve him the enemy pie. Oh, the son was all excited. I could do that. So he goes out, and you know, the father's working on the pie, and the son is like, wait a minute, this smells good. What's up with that? He said, no, that's all part of the plan. We got to get him to eat the pie. So it's got to smell good. It can't be rancid looking or smell bad. You know, we've got to have this attractive. So this boy Jeremiah is going to want to eat a piece of this. And oh, that's brilliant, Dad. We're going to get him with the enemy pie. So what does he do? No, the next day he goes down the street and he talks to Jeremiah. He says, hey, can we go out and play? And the mom says, yep. And they play over at Jeremiah's house, and they hang out for a little while. They come back to the boy's house, and they play a little while. They're having a good time. And Jeremiah says, hey, let's go up to the tree house. And all of a sudden the boy's, well, So he says, well, let me go first. And, this is breaking all of his rules. No enemies allowed in the treehouse. So this little boy, he climbs up the treehouse, he grabs the piece of paper, he shoves it in his pocket, and he lets Jeremiah come up there. And they play in the treehouse, they're having a great time, and everything seems to be going pretty good. And suddenly, the little boy's having a little change of heart, and he's like, oh, what's going to happen with this enemy pie? And he's really starting to wonder. He's hitting the panic button. I don't want him to get hurt or anything like that. And all of a sudden, Dad calls him down for dinner. And they have this, like the mac and cheese and everything, all the fun stuff, and they're eating. And finally, he brings out the enemy pie. And the little boy is like, he kicks his father under the table. He's like, don't feed it to him. Don't give it to him. He's all afraid. He's concerned. And the father's like, we got this covered. And the father cuts a slice, and he puts it over there in front of Jeremiah. And then he cuts himself a slice, and he puts it over by him. And then he cuts a slice, and he puts it over by his son. And the son's like, oh no, he's going to eat the pie. He's really flipping out. And he's kicking his father again. And the father takes his fork, and he picks it, and he eats some. And the dad eats it in front of the son. And the son's like, it can't be that bad. Maybe it's all right. And then Jeremiah takes it for, oh, this is the best pie I've ever had. And then Jeremiah just woofs it down. And at the end of the day, Jeremiah went home, and he was all grateful. And the son was like, he was kind of confused. And he gets a phone call a couple hours later. It's Jeremiah's mom, and wondering if the little boy can come over and play with him the next day. And that's the story of enemy pie. So perhaps there's some people in your world who are enemies, and you need to love them. You need to do good to them. You need to speak well of them. You need to pray for them. And maybe this week you need to serve a slice of enemy pie. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the fact that while we were enemies of you, you sent your Son to die so that we could be reconciled and forgiven. And we pray, Lord, this morning that you would help us as we are interfacing a very toxic culture, that there are people out there who despise us, they hate us. There is so much friction on social media and at the workplace and in school systems, everywhere we go, even in our own homes. I'm hearing more and more stories of families that are just deeply divided over politics, over religion, over ideology. And I pray, Father, that you would help us to put this very simple message into practice, to love, to do good deeds, to speak well, and to pray. Help us, Lord, to find practical ways of being a blessing to those who despise us. And we know, and we're realistic, Father, we understand that this is not going to change everyone. This is not going to create harmony with all people. There will be some out there who will continue to hate, who will continue to be divisive. But we have our part to play. And your word tells us that as far as it depends upon us, and this is our part, that we need to live in peace with others. And I pray you would help us to do our part and to leave the rest in your hands. And Lord, we just thank you that Jesus has given us the ultimate example. We thank you that we have these words that we can cling to. And we thank you that your Spirit is here empowering us to put into practice something that we can't possibly do on our own. And we need you and we seek you now and ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to close our service with a hymn, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. It's an old English hymn that was penned back in the 1700s. If you could stand, would you please do so? And we'll sing our closing hymn and then be dismissed.